The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was the most powerful room in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of Sector Zero, inside a space station so large that it had its own weather systems, its own gravity zones, and its own small sun built into the ceiling to light the hall during sessions. 47 species had seats in that hall. 47 flags hung from the walls. 47 voices had shaped the laws of the galaxy for over 3,000 years. Humanity had been given a seat 6 years ago, a small seat, a seat near the back. Yuna walked into the hall alone. She was Earth's chief diplomatic envoy, the face of humanity at every council session for the past 4 years. She was not tall. She did not carry weapons. She wore a plain dark uniform with a single silver pin on her chest, the seal of the United Earth Federation. She carried a small tablet under her arm and a cup of cold coffee she had not had time to finish before the session began. The hall was already full. Every delegate from every species was in their seat. The lights above the main podium were bright and white. The air smelled faintly of something chemical, the way it always did when too many different alien life support systems were running in the same room. Yuna walked to the human podium, set down her coffee and her tablet, and waited. The Vreth High Consul spoke first. He was tall, gray-skinned, and very old. His species, the Vreth, had been on the council longer than most civilizations had been spacefaring. He spoke slowly, in the common galactic tongue, and his voice carried across the entire hall without effort. He began with a long introduction about peace, about the stability of the galaxy, about the duty of the Council to protect all member species from disorder. He talked about balance and harmony. He used the word protection many times. Then he got to the point. The Vreth High Consul announced that the Galactic Council had completed a full intelligence review of humanity's outer colonies. He said the review had found that human expansion beyond their home system had become a point of instability. He said the colonies were poorly defended, that they attracted dangerous elements, and that the Council was concerned about human safety. He said all of this with a calm, flat voice and a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. Then he announced the terms. Humanity was to hand over administrative control of all 14 outer colonies within 30 cycles. The colonies would be placed under Council protective custody. Human residents would remain in place and would be treated fairly. Earth would retain its council seat and its home system. In exchange, the Council would guarantee Earth's safety from outside threats. The hall was quiet when he finished. Many delegates were watching Yuna. Some were leaning forward slightly. A few whispered to each other behind their hands. Yuna did not move. She stood at the podium with her hands resting flat on the surface and looked at the High Consul with an expression that was very hard to read. Not angry, not afraid, not even surprised. She simply looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they have been expecting for a long time. The High Consul asked formally if the human envoy had a response. What happened next was talked about for a long time afterward in council circles. Delegates who were there that day described it differently depending on who was telling the story, but they all agreed on one thing. The silence before she spoke was the loudest part. Yuna picked up her tablet. She looked down at it once. Then she set it back down. She looked at the High Consul and said clearly in a voice that did not shake at all, "You have mistaken grief for hesitation, Consul." That was all. She picked up her coffee, turned around and walked out of the hall. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor. No one spoke until the doors closed behind her. The hall erupted after that. Delegates turned to each other. Some laughed, not out of humor but out of relief, the kind of laugh that comes when a feared thing turns out to be smaller than expected. The Vreth High Consul exchanged a look with his senior advisor. The advisor gave a small nod. The consul turned back to the room and declared that humanity's lack of formal response would be treated as non-objection. In private, the council's chief intelligence officer sent a note to the consul's chamber that read, "Confirmed. Their envoy left without filing a counter-declaration. Our assessment stands. They will not resist." No one in that room understood what Yuna had said. They thought she had walked away. They thought the words were emotion, sadness, maybe, or the quiet noise of a species accepting something it could not change. They did not consider the other meaning. Far from the Grand Hall, on the dark side of the moon that orbited Earth, a long flat building sat half buried under the surface. It had no signs outside. It had no windows. It had been there for 11 years, and almost no one outside the United Earth Federation Senior Command knew exactly what happened inside it. Admiral Minyi sat in a chair at the center of the building's main operations room. He was a big man, quiet by habit, with close-cut gray hair and hands that had spent 30 years signing documents and making decisions that other people carried out. Around him, screens covered every wall. Staff moved between stations. The hum of cooling systems ran under everything like a low note that never stopped. A transmission came in from the council station. His assistant brought it to him on a printed sheet, a habit left over from the old days when digital transmissions could be intercepted and paper could not. Minyi read it once. He read it the way he read everything, without expression, completely to the end. He folded the sheet. He set it on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached forward and pressed the button on his comm panel that opened the fleet-wide channel. Every ship under UEF command, from the patrol vessels in the inner system to the carriers sitting dark and silent in the deep black of the outer belt, heard his voice at the same time. "All hands," he said, "Condition 1. He released the button. Around him, the operations room shifted. Screens changed. Voices became lower and faster. Someone was already pulling up fleet positions. Someone else was running a check on the communication blackout protocols. Minyi stood up and walked to the large window at the far end of the room. It looked out through the rock and regolith of the lunar surface, through a long, transparent tube, at the black sky above. Stars sat still and cold and very far away. He was not afraid. That was the thing that would have confused the council's analysts most if they could have seen him in that moment. He was not nervous either. What he felt was closer to a kind of tired clarity, the feeling of a man who has spent a very long time waiting for something and has finally been told it is coming. On 14 outer colonies, across millions of kilometers of empty space, lights began to change. Power systems that had been running quietly at low levels began to draw more. In buildings that looked like storage facilities and energy plants, things that were not storage facilities or energy plants began to wake up. On the colony of Hejian 7, a young soldier named Tiang looked up from his meal, felt the lights flicker once, and knew what it meant. He set his food down. He looked at the 3 soldiers sitting across from him. "Get your gear," he said. "It's time." None of them asked any questions. They had known for 2 weeks that this day was coming. They had been ready for it longer than that. Outside the colony walls, the stars looked exactly the same as they always did. Calm, cold, completely indifferent. But something had changed. Something that the council, sitting in its grand hall 40 light years away, would not understand until it was already too late to change course. Humanity had heard the terms. And humanity had already decided. The Council's peacekeeping armada left Sector 0 6 days after the Grand Hall session. 200 warships, organized into 4 battle groups, moved through the lanes of deep space toward the outer edge of human territory. It was a large force. It was, by most galactic standards, an overwhelming one. The Council's fleet commanders had looked at Earth's defense reports, reviewed the estimated size of the UEF, and concluded that the show of force alone would be enough. No fighting would be needed. The humans would see the ships and understand. The fleet moved through 3 relay points. At each relay, the commanders expected to pick up signals from the human colonies, distress calls, civilian broadcasts, diplomatic messages requesting talks. There was nothing. The human frequencies were completely silent. No emergency signals, no demands, no protests. Not even the standard automated traffic beacons that colony ships used to navigate the lanes. Just silence. The fleet's chief communications officer noted it in her log and sent a report to the lead commander. He read it, set it aside, and told her to continue monitoring. The silence, he decided, was confirmation. The humans had gone quiet because there was nothing left to say. They were preparing to accept the terms. It was over. He was wrong, but he would not know that for some time yet. Back on the moon base, Dahi was already awake when the first movement reports came in from the Council fleet's advanced position. She had been awake for most of the night, which was not unusual for her. Sleep was something she fit in between tasks when she had to. Her office was a small room with no windows, 3 screens, and a wall covered in physical maps that she had printed herself because she liked to look at the whole picture at once without scrolling. She was the UEF's chief intelligence officer, and she had spent the last 3 years building a file on how the Galactic Council understood humanity. Not how humanity actually was, how the Council thought it was. The difference between those two things was something she found very important. She pulled the file now, walked into Admiral Minyi's war room, and set a data chip on the table. Minyi looked at the chip, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She did not usually need to be asked twice for anything, but she appreciated that he asked. She walked him through it without notes, because she had been carrying it in her head for long enough that she did not need them. The Council had begun gathering intelligence on humanity the moment Earth made first contact with a Vreth survey ship 14 years ago. They had been thorough. They had built enormous files. They had employed whole teams of analysts to study human behavior, human history, human psychology. And every single team had made the same mistake. They had looked at humans during their most visible moments, the moments humans chose to show the galaxy. Yuna at the podium, speaking calmly about cooperation. The medical ships Earth sent when a dust storm collapsed 3,000 structures on a Vreth colony. The long public debates on Earth about whether or not to even build a standing military at all. The protests. The peace movements. The recordings of humans crying at funerals and memorials and the ends of old wars. The Council's analysts had built their entire assessment on the public face of a species. They had never once looked at the quiet years, the years between the big moments, the years when no one was watching. Dahi pointed to a map on the screen, 14 outer colonies. On the Council's charts, each one was labeled with a population count, an estimated economic output, and a threat rating. Every threat rating was low. The Council's ships had scanned each colony multiple times during normal patrol routes. They had seen civilian buildings, energy plants, and communication arrays. Nothing dangerous. She pressed a button. The same colonies appeared on a different map, the real one. Every civilian building had a secondary structure underneath it or adjacent to it. The energy plants were not only energy plants. The communication arrays had a second layer that ran on completely different frequencies. In total, across 14 colonies, humanity had quietly built what amounted to 14 fully operational defensive fortresses, each one designed to look exactly like a normal civilian settlement from the outside, and to function as a military platform from the inside. It had taken 18 years. It had never been secret. It was all in the public record, buried in infrastructure budgets and zoning documents, and engineering contracts that any council analyst could have found if they had been looking for it. But no one had looked, because the same analysts who reviewed those documents had already decided what humanity was. Once the conclusion was made, the details stopped mattering. Minyi listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How long until the Council's fleet reaches Hejon 7? He asked. 41 hours, she said. And Tiang, already in position, has been for 2 weeks. Minyi nodded slowly. "They're going to be very surprised," he said. He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it the way someone says a thing that is simply true. On Hejon 7, Tiang sat on a low ridge outside the colony's eastern edge. The ground was red and dry. The sky was a deep orange color in the early hours of the cycle. Behind him, 32 soldiers from the Special Warfare Division were spread out in positions that were invisible from the air, invisible from orbit, and almost invisible from the ground unless you already knew they were there. They had been quiet for 2 weeks. They slept in shifts. They ate cold food. They talked in low voices when they talked at all. Tiang had served for 16 years. He had been in 3 active deployments before this one, in conflicts that never made it into the Council's intelligence files because they had happened inside human space before humanity was watching. He knew how to wait. His unit knew how to wait. Waiting was not the same as doing nothing. Waiting was preparation that looked like stillness. He watched the sky through a long scope. Nothing yet, but the signal from Luna Base had told him 41 hours. He trusted the number. He looked over at the soldier nearest to him, a young man who had been on his first actual deployment and had done very well so far. He had been quiet and careful, and had not asked unnecessary questions. Nervous, Tiang asked him quietly. The young soldier thought about it. A little, he said. Is that bad? No, Tiang said, that's correct. They went back to watching the sky. Inside the colony, Engineer Sora sat in a room below one of the buildings that the Council's charts labeled as a power distribution hub. It was a power distribution hub. It was also something else. She had helped design the secondary systems in this building 6 years ago, as part of a quiet UEF infrastructure program that had funded construction across all 14 colonies. She had also helped design the systems in 9 of the other 13 colonies. She was very good at building things that looked like one thing and were also another thing. She ran her final check now. Every system came back green. The grid was ready. The targeting arrays were calibrated. The comm-jamming layers were standing by on passive mode. Everything was waiting for one signal from Luna Base to come fully online. Sora leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She thought about all the Council ships moving through deep space toward this place, full of commanders and crews who thought they were coming to collect something that was already theirs. She almost felt sorry for them. Then her screen blinked. A short automated message from Luna Base, 3 words. Stand by, ready. Sora sat forward. She put her hands on the console. 40 hours and 59 minutes remained. Somewhere in deep space, the Council's lead vessel received a strange signal from the direction of Hejon 7. It was not a communication. It was not a warning. It was a set of coordinates, precise, perfectly calculated coordinates marking every blind spot in the Council fleet's current sensor formation. It was delivered in 47 alien languages simultaneously, formatted like a courtesy notice, the kind of thing you might send to someone before a navigation test to make sure their instruments were calibrated. The lead commander stared at it for a long time. His senior tactical officer stood beside him and said nothing. Neither of them spoke. The bridge was completely quiet. The commander's hand was not steady when he reached for the comm panel. He pulled it back before pressing anything. He looked at the coordinates again. Every single one was accurate. He knew that without checking. He knew it in the way a person knows something that lands in their stomach before it reaches their brain. Whoever sent that signal had been watching his entire fleet, from the beginning, in complete silence. He finally pressed the comm panel and called for a full sensor sweep. It came back clean. There was nothing out there, nothing at all. That was when he started to feel, for the first time, that something about this situation was not what he had been told it would be. The asteroid belt between the outer colonies and the Council's approach lane had a name in the old navigation charts, the Gray Scatter, because from a distance it looked like a wide gray smear across the dark. It was dense enough to make direct travel through it slow and difficult, but the lanes around its edges were clear and well mapped. The Council's fleet commanders had plotted their course around the southern edge, exactly as all traffic in that area did. The Gray Scatter was a navigational inconvenience, nothing more. At least that was how it appeared. Sitting inside the scatter, completely still, completely silent, were 6 human carrier ships and their full complement of strike craft, support vessels, and 1 command ship. They had been there for 3 weeks. They were running no active signals. Their engines were at the lowest possible output, producing barely more heat than the rocks around them. Their hulls had been coated in a layer of material that Sara's engineering division had developed over the course of 7 years, which scattered sensor returns in a way that made large metal objects red as irregular stone formations. To the Council's fleet, there was nothing in the scatter but rock. Commander Junho stood at the front of the command ship's bridge and watched the Council fleet's approach on a passive sensor display. He was a lean man, not particularly tall, with the kind of quiet about him that came not from shyness but from habit. He had commanded ships for 14 years. He had spent most of those years in the kind of deployments that never made it onto official records, the work that got done in the dark, in the silence, without ceremony. He watched the Council fleet move along the southern lane in clean formation, 200 ships. The formation was tight and professional. He respected that, at least. They were not careless. He turned to the man at the communications station and gave him a single nod. The man nodded back and sent a short encoded pulse to the strike wing bay below. In the bay, Wusung was already in his craft. He had been suited up for 6 hours. The other pilots of the first strike wing, 54 craft in total, were all in their seats, all systems warm, all waiting. They had rehearsed this specific engagement 11 times in simulation over the past 3 weeks. Each run had been slightly different. Each time, Junho had changed one variable, one ship position, one timing detail, one approach angle, and the pilots had adapted. By the 11th run, they could do it without a single voice communication. That was the point. Wusung felt the small vibration of the signal pulse come through his seat, not loud, barely a sensation, but clear. He released his docking clamps. 53 other craft did the same, at the same moment without sound. They came out of the scatter from 6 different points, moving at angles that put them immediately in the gaps of the Council formation, the exact blind spots that had been sent to the lead commander 2 days ago as a courtesy warning. The Council fleet's outer sensors were slow to pick them up because they had not expected anything to come from inside the scatter. By the time the first Council ship identified what it was seeing, the first strike wing was already inside the formation's outer perimeter. On the bridge of the Council's lead vessel, the tactical alarm went off. The commander, who had not slept well since receiving the coordinates message, felt his stomach drop before his mind fully processed what was on his screen. "Human strike craft," his tactical officer said. The man's voice was flat with the particular kind of shock that comes from seeing something your brain told you was impossible. Inside the perimeter, 54 contacts. No, he checked again. 61. No, 64. The commander stared at the display. Where did they come from? No one answered him. Junho opened a communication channel to the Council fleet. His voice came through on the main frequency, calm and unhurried, as if he were asking what the weather was like. "Council fleet, this is Commander Junho of the United Earth Federation Battle Group Ironclad. Your formation is currently inside a complete engagement envelope. We have full targeting solutions on all 200 vessels in your group. I want to be direct with you. We have no intention of destroying your ships. Your crews are not our enemies. You were sent here by people who gave you bad information, and that is not your fault." He paused. "You have 20 minutes to begin withdrawal. I am giving you this time because I believe in giving people a chance to make the right choice. After 20 minutes, we will begin disabling your fleet's propulsion and weapons systems, starting from the rear and working forward. No one needs to die today. That decision is yours." He closed the channel. On the Council's bridge, the commander turned to his senior officers. His first instinct was to order return fire. His second instinct was to calculate the odds. He had 200 ships against 64 strike craft. On paper, it was not a contest. But the strike craft were already inside the formation, and the humans had clearly known every blind spot before the engagement began. And they had sat hidden in a dense asteroid field for an unknown amount of time with no signals and no detected heat output, which should have been impossible. His senior weapons officer leaned over and said quietly, "Sir, they have targeting locks on every ship. They had them before we even knew they were here." The commander said nothing. He looked at the display. He looked at the countdown that Junho had not stated but that he was now running in his head. He had never felt something like this before. It was not quite fear. It was something more specific, the sensation of realizing that the situation you thought you understood was in fact something very different, and that the person across from you had understood it completely the entire time. 18 minutes passed. In those 18 minutes, the Council fleet did not withdraw. The commander was proud. His species valued pride. He spent 15 of those minutes telling himself that the humans were bluffing, that 64 craft could not disable 200 warships, that the math was simply not possible. The last 3 minutes, he spent watching his rear flank disappear from the tactical display, one ship at a time. Not destroyed. The icons on the display changed color from active to disabled, as one by one, the ships at the back of the formation had their engine cores neutralized and their weapons arrays shut down. No explosions, no fires. The ships were simply switched off cleanly and precisely, the way you might turn off a light. The hulls were intact. The crews were unharmed. It was done with a speed and accuracy that made the commander's senior tactical officer set down his headset and sit very still. Wusung's hands moved across his controls with the kind of ease that came from doing something so many times in practice that the real version felt almost slower than the simulation. He did not think about the ships he was disabling as enemies. He thought about angles and timing and his position relative to the other pilots. They moved as a group the way a school of fish moves, not because someone was telling each one what to do, but because they all understood the shape of the whole thing. With 2 minutes remaining on Junho's window, 43 ships at the rear of the Council formation had been disabled. Junho opened the channel again. "You have 2 minutes remaining, Commander. We are not barbarians, but we are not afraid of you either." The Council fleet commander sat in his chair for a long moment. His hands were flat on the armrests. His bridge was silent. Then he gave the order to withdraw. The remaining active ships began to pull back, slowly at first, then faster as the order spread through the formation. They left behind 43 ships that sat dark and still in space, intact, no casualties, floating quietly like lights that someone had turned off. The first strike wing did not pursue. They pulled back to the edge of the scatter and held position. Wusung watched the Council ships retreat on his display and felt nothing dramatic. Just a quiet, steady feeling, the way you feel after something you trained for a long time goes the way it was supposed to go. Junho watched the fleet go. He did not feel like celebrating. He did not feel like much of anything except tired. He had known this would work. He had built the plan carefully and it had run the way it was planned to run. That was all. What he had not planned for, what he had not quite expected, was the call from Luna Base that came in 40 minutes later. Dahi's voice was controlled, but he knew her well enough to hear what was underneath it. "The Council called an emergency recess," she said. Junho raised his eyebrows slightly. "How long?" "It's still going," she said. "They've been in session for 30 minutes. The High Consul hasn't spoken publicly since the session started." There was a pause. "Junho," she said, 7 species have already requested updated intelligence files on human military capability. 7, in 30 minutes. Junho looked out the window at the silent shape of the scatter behind him. He thought about everything it had taken to build to this moment. All the quiet years, all the unseen preparation, all the times someone in the galaxy had looked at humanity and seen something small. "Good," he said simply. He closed the channel and looked at the stars. 40 light-years away, in the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council, 47 species were learning, for the first time, that they had never actually known what humanity was. And that feeling, that specific, cold, creeping feeling of realizing you have badly misjudged something, was only just beginning. The second time Yuna walked into the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council, the hall felt different. The first time, the room had been full of a particular kind of energy, the buzzing, confident noise of people who believed they already knew how a story ended. This time, the hall was full of a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when many people are thinking very hard and none of them want to be the first to speak. Every seat was filled. Every delegate was present. Even species that rarely sent their senior representatives to ordinary sessions had their highest-ranking officials in the room today. Yuna walked through the main doors and did not stop. Behind her in a line came Junho in his dress uniform, Tiang in his and Sara in hers. The four of them moved at a steady pace up the long central aisle. Their footsteps were the only sound. Nara walked behind them at a slight distance, carrying a case of documents. She was young, the UEF's liaison officer, and she had been at the council station for the past 2 years. She had watched the first session from the side gallery. She had watched everything that happened since from her post at the human delegation's office. She had seen many things she would not forget, but she thought she would remember this walk most of all. The High Consul was already at his position. He watched the humans come down the aisle with an expression that was difficult to name. It was not angry. It was not welcoming. It was the expression of a very experienced person processing something that did not fit any category they had prepared for. Yuna reached the human podium. She stood behind it and looked at the consul for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the full assembly, every delegate, every screen, every pair of eyes in the room. She began to speak. She did not begin with the battle. She did not begin with the gray scatter or the disabled fleet or the coordinates message. She began further back. She talked about the first time a council intelligence team had visited Earth 12 years ago and what they had seen. She described it plainly, without bitterness. The team had come during a public memorial for a disaster that had killed several thousand people in a coastal region. They had watched the ceremonies. They had recorded the speeches and the tears and the silence. They had filed a report that described humanity as a species deeply traumatized by its own history of violence, emotionally unable to face further conflict. She said that report was accurate, and it missed everything important. She talked about what grief actually was, not weakness, not the absence of strength. Grief was what you felt when something mattered to you, when you had built something, or loved something, or lived inside something long enough for it to become part of you, and then lost it. Humans grieved hard because humans held on hard. And the same part of them that held on, that refused to let go of people and places, and the things they had built, was the exact same part that made them very dangerous when those things were threatened. The council had looked at the tears at the memorial and concluded, these people are afraid of pain. They had never considered the other possibility. These people know exactly how much pain costs, and they will do anything to protect the things that matter to them. The High Consul leaned forward slightly. The question of your psychological profile is not the primary issue before this council today, Envoy. It is the only issue before this council today, Consul, Yuna said quietly. Because every decision your body made about humanity was built on a misreading of what we are. We would like to correct the record. She nodded to Dahi, who was seated at the side panel. Dahi stood and began presenting. What followed was 40 minutes of the most uncomfortable intelligence review the Galactic Council had ever sat through. Dahi presented the Council's own reports, their own files, their own analysts' conclusions, their own internal communications, alongside the actual record of what humanity had been doing at the same time. She did not argue or editorialize. She simply put the two things side by side and let the room see the gap between them. The Council had noted, 7 years ago, that Earth was investing heavily in outer colony infrastructure. Their report concluded it was economic development. The actual investment had included the construction of defensive platforms in all 14 colonies. The documentation for this had been publicly filed with the UEF Infrastructure Bureau and was available to anyone who requested it. No one had. The Council had noted, 4 years ago, that human military spending appeared to be decreasing as a percentage of national output. It was, because the construction phase was complete and the ongoing maintenance cost was lower. A junior council analyst had flagged this as a possible discrepancy. The note had been reviewed and dismissed by a senior analyst who wrote in the margin, consistent with known human conflict aversion pattern. The council had noted 2 years ago that Earth had significantly increased pilot training hours across its strike wings. The report filed by the monitoring team described this as routine safety improvements. The word routine appeared 6 times in a document that should have had alarm signals attached to every paragraph. Several delegates were very still as Dahi spoke. One of the Vreth senior advisors had stopped writing notes. He was just listening. When Dahi finished, the hall was quiet for a long moment. The High Consul said carefully, "You are suggesting our intelligence apparatus failed at a foundational level." "I am showing you that it did," Dahi said. "Not because your people are not capable, because they were given a conclusion first and asked to find evidence for it second." More quiet. Then Tiang was given the floor. He had not been part of the original agenda. Yuna had added him at the last moment because she felt the room needed to hear from someone who was not a diplomat or an analyst. He walked to the secondary speaking position, which was a lower podium to the right of the main one. He was not a tall man, but he stood like someone who had decided long ago that height was not the relevant measurement. He did not have a prepared speech. He looked at the assembled delegates for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and very level. "I have been a soldier for 16 years, he said. "I have served in conflicts that most of you do not have records of because they happened inside our space. I have watched people I served with die. I have been injured 3 times. I have made decisions that I carry with me every day." He paused. "I want you to understand something. Every human soldier I have ever served with hated war. Not some of them, all of them. We hate it the way you hate something that takes from you constantly and gives nothing back. We know exactly what it costs. We can list the cost by name because most of us have a list." He let that sit for a moment. "We have been in wars that lasted 100 years. We have starved and burned and nearly destroyed ourselves, and we are still here. We did not survive all of that to be afraid of you." He stepped back from the podium. The silence this time was different from all the other silences the hall had held that day. It was deeper. Several delegates were looking at the table in front of them. One of the smaller species representatives, a creature with large round eyes who had said nothing all session, was staring at Tiang with an expression of complete attention. The High Consul was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, in a tone that had lost the flatness it usually carried, what humanity's terms were. Yuna opened the document case that Nara had been holding. She took out a single printed document, physical paper, the kind that had no digital component to intercept or alter. She walked it across the floor herself and placed it on the surface in front of the High Consul. He looked down at it. It was not a list of demands. It was not a declaration of war or a claim for damages or a list of conditions. It was a revised mutual defense treaty, one that replaced the original council membership framework with something built on equal standing, equitable contribution, shared access, no protective custody clauses, no colony surrender terms, no language that treated any species as less than another. It had been written by a team of human and allied legal scholars over the course of 2 years, quietly, in the expectation that this moment would eventually come. The High Consul read it slowly. His senior advisor leaned over and read it with him. 3 council member species raised their signing flags before the consul had finished reading. 3 more did so while he was still on the second page. He reached the end. He looked at Yuna. She was watching him with that same expression she had worn in the hall before, not angry, not cold, not triumphant, just steady. He reached for the pen. In the side gallery, a junior delegate from a small species that had joined the council only 8 years ago leaned toward his senior colleague and whispered in their shared language, "We almost went to war with them. We almost went to war with them, and we didn't even know what they were." His colleague did not answer. She was watching the High Consul sign the document. Her face said everything her mouth did not. The pen touched the paper, and 47 species entered a new chapter of history, one that none of them had written the beginning of, but all of them would have to live inside from this point forward. 3 months after the Sector Zero Accord was signed, the colony of Hejan 7 looked exactly the way it always had from the outside. The red ground was the same. The orange sky was the same. The buildings stood in the same rows, and the roads between them carried the same slow traffic of vehicles and people going about the daily business of living on a colony world far from home. Children were back in school. The market near the colony's center was open again. The smell of food from the stalls near the east wall drifted out into the dry air every morning the way it always had. Below some of those buildings, the secondary systems were still there, powered down now, all of them, but present. Nobody had been asked to dismantle them yet. The UEF had left that decision open for the time being. There were people in the Council's new Joint Security Committee who found the existence of those systems uncomfortable. There were humans who thought that was a reasonable feeling for them to have. And there were humans who thought that discomfort was, in itself, a useful thing, the kind that reminded you to be honest in your dealings with the people who had caused to build what was underneath those floors. Tiang was the last of his unit to leave Hejan 7. He always let his people go first when a deployment ended. It was a habit he had never been able to fully explain, something about wanting to be the last one standing in a place before it returned to being a place where nobody was standing guard. He walked through the colony one final time before his transport arrived. He nodded to people he passed. A few of them knew who he was and what his unit had done, and they nodded back in a way that meant something more than just hello. Most of them did not know and did not need to. They were living their lives, which was the entire point. He sat outside the transport bay and waited. The sky above was clear. He looked at it for a while without thinking about anything in particular. His transport came. He picked up his bag and got on. He did not look back. Sara was already back on Luna Base by the time Tiang's transport left Hejan 7. She had 14 debrief sessions, 4 design reviews, and a full engineering audit of every defensive system across all the colonies to get through before she could think about taking any time off. She was working on the 3rd debrief when a message came through from one of the Council's newest allied species, the Vaori, a quiet and technically gifted civilization that had been among the first 3 to sign the accord. The message was a formal request. The Vaori wanted to know if UEF engineering teams would be willing to consult on a defensive infrastructure project for their home system. They were very polite about it. They said 3 times in the message that they understood if the answer was no. They said they would not be offended by a refusal. Sara read the message twice. Then she forwarded it to Admiral Minyi with a short note attached. "This is the 5th request this month. I think we need a formal program." Minyi sent back 2 words, "Build it." She started the file that same afternoon. It was not just the Vaori. In the 3 months since the accord, 6 different species had quietly reached out to UEF Command requesting some form of military consultation. Not all of them wanted infrastructure. Some wanted doctrine. Some wanted training frameworks. Some wanted, simply, someone to talk to about how you built a defense strategy when your species had no significant history of large-scale conflict, and had suddenly realized that the galaxy was not as safe as the Council had always told them it was. Humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy. Everyone understood that. The Vreth were older and had more ships. Several other species had technology that surpassed Earth's in specific areas. What humanity had that no one else seemed to have was a particular kind of knowledge. The knowledge that came from having fought yourself, inside your own borders, across your own history, for long enough that war was not an abstraction to you. It was something your civilization had lived through and survived and carried inside it. The understanding that strength and the hatred of violence were not opposite things, that you could mourn every war deeply and still be the most prepared civilization in the room, was something that could not be learned from a book or a simulation. It had to come from somewhere real. For humanity, it came from a history that was full of darkness and also full of the particular stubborn refusal to stay in the dark. That was what the other species were asking for, even the ones who did not have the words for it yet. Junho was given leave after the debrief cycle ended. He took it, which surprised some of his staff. He spent the first week doing almost nothing. He slept, which was something his body had needed for a long time. He ate meals that were not ship rations. He went outside and walked in places that were not corridors. On the 8th day of his leave, he went back to the ironclad. He told his crew he was just checking in, which everyone accepted as a perfectly normal thing for him to do, because it was perfectly normal for him to do. He stood on the observation deck at the front of the ship and looked at the planet below. Not Earth this time, a transit stop, a colony world closer to the outer belt. It was a small world, mostly gray-green with thin cloud cover. Nothing dramatic, just a place where people lived. Sora came up behind him. She had been on board for a supply transfer and had seen his name on the manifest. She had brought 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it, because she knew he always wanted it. They stood together and looked at the planet for a while. "Did you think it would work?" she asked eventually. "The whole thing from the beginning?" Junho thought about it. He was not a person who answered questions faster than he needed to. "I thought it could work," he said. "That's not the same thing." Sora nodded. That was a good enough answer for her. They finished their coffee in silence. Outside, the stars were everywhere, cold and still and very far apart. Wusung filed his last debrief report from the first strike wing 3 weeks after returning to base. He was thorough with paperwork, which was something his flight commander had always found surprising in a pilot who was otherwise very loose about procedural details. He said it was because the record mattered. You had to be honest in the record. At the bottom of the debrief document, there was a field for personal notes. It was optional. Most pilots left it blank. Wusung looked at the empty field for a while before he typed anything. Then he wrote, "They thought we were afraid. We're always afraid. That was never the point." He filed the report and closed his screen and went to find something to eat. Yuna stayed at the council station. The Accord had created a new standing committee, the Joint Galactic Security Forum, and Earth had been asked to co-chair it. She accepted. Because it was the right thing to do, and because the alternative was leaving it to someone else who might do it less carefully. The work was slow and often frustrating. 47 species had 47 different ways of understanding almost everything, and the process of finding shared language for shared problems was not fast or clean. There were sessions that lasted 12 hours and produced 2 agreed sentences. There were days when she sat in rooms full of alien voices and felt the weight of how much distance there was between all of them. But the signatures were on the document. That was real. That had happened. She signed the first joint deep space exploration charter on a Tuesday in a small office off the main hall with no ceremony. 2 council representatives were present as witnesses. She uncapped the pen, signed her name, recapped the pen, and set it down. The representatives nodded. That was all. She looked out the window at the stars. Nara filed her formal report on the full sequence of events 2 months after the Accord signing. It was long. She had tried to capture everything accurately: the Grand Hall session, the silence of the frequencies, the gray scatter engagement, the second session, the signing. She wrote carefully because she understood that this was a document that might be read by people who had not been there, and she wanted them to understand not just what happened but what it had meant. The last line of the report she rewrote 4 times before she was satisfied with it. It read, "Recommend updating the public record for the benefit of any civilization that makes the same mistake the Council did. Humanity does not fight because it is unafraid. Humanity fights because some things are worth being afraid for." She submitted it, then she went back to work. Across the galaxy, 47 species updated their intelligence files on humanity that year. Every classification was reviewed. Every threat rating was reconsidered. Every summary was rewritten. The teams doing the work went back through everything, every old report, every filed observation, every margin note where someone had written, consistent with known human conflict aversion pattern, and never questioned it. When the updates were complete, every file had a new classification marker at the top. Not threat, not ally, not neutral. The Council's Records Office had never had to create a new classification before. In 3,000 years, every species in the known galaxy had fit into one of the existing categories. They created a new one for humanity. It read simply, "Never underestimate." Below it, in the required field for classification justification, the reviewing officer, a young Vreth analyst who had been assigned to the project fresh out of training, had typed a single sentence after reading through the full human file from beginning to end. She had stared at her screen for a long time before writing it. Then she had written it anyway because it was accurate, and accuracy was her job. It read, "They always knew what they were. We simply never asked them.